All right, well, welcome everybody to the first of probably many. This one is going to be geared more towards what I feel a home cultivator would need to be successful in producing a consistent harvest of mushrooms. So not just kind of a one and done idea, some of our grow kits are great introductions to growing mushrooms and growing your environment. But this, we're going to go through the whole process, the life cycle, from a petri dish or spore, or buying a syringe and starting your own petri dish and spore, to making your own grain spawn, and then finally to going to your final substrate and then fruiting your mushrooms. So as I go through all of this stuff, there is lots of mycology specific jargon: mycelium, substrate, spawn, agar, petri dish, all of these things that home mushroom cultivations, people that have a hobby in growing plants and have enough knowledge still aren't very specific with. This is kind of where home cultivation meets biology and biological control. So if anybody's ever brewed beer here or done anything where you're taking organic material and hoping of fermenting it or controlling a biological process in any way and getting a specific result, you know you have to be clean at some point. At some point, you can't just sit here and mix a bunch of things together, put it in a bucket, and hope for the best to happen, because you know nature will do otherwise. So what we do here is basically try to grow, encourage, and deliver all of this organic material as clean as we can until it reaches its final stage of growth. So just like brewing beer, you start out by putting everything in the dishwasher, right? Okay, everything has to start clean, all of your mixing equipment, everything. So this is where the very beginning of mushroom growing at home is the most important, to be aware of how clean and sterile everything has to be. So if any of you have done anything at home as far as media transfer, has anybody used a still air box? A glove box that they've built themselves? Nobody's familiar? This is the most basic way to do sterile transfers of media from one container to another. And so what I mean by sterile, we're all sitting in this room right now covered, loaded with bacterias, molds, yeast, everything. It's just floating around. It's on your skin, it's in your hair, it's in your mouth, it's everywhere. If we could imagine clean, fresh air as blue in here, and we could all see this cloud of blue, and everything that was a contaminant on us would be red, this whole place would be purple. Okay? Nothing in here is clean, sterile air. Nothing that we do at home will ever be clean, sterile air, but we can get it as close as we can, and that's the mentality you really have to think about. You have to assume everything that you touch, move, or open has this bright red dust coming off of it unless you've cleaned it or sterilized it. Okay, so just give yourself this visual knowing that everything is dirty. So a still air box basically is a setup that we have armholes in that you can seal up. We can load all of our media that we're looking to transfer in here, and we can also apply cleaning agents such as alcohol. That's my go-to. It's the fastest, it's the easiest to use, it evaporates, it's very effective. You can use bleach in here, not recommended if you're gonna be in there for very long. You can use hydrogen peroxide, again, will irritate your skin, but does a fantastic job of eliminating things, leaves water behind. So what we use is just a 90%, 99% alcohol. You can get that here, you can get it at pretty much anywhere, and we dilute it to 80%. So alcohol is our main cleaning component, and we will sterilize pretty much anything that we move and put into this still air box. Now what alcohol does to most things is it penetrates through osmosis. So the reason why you don't want to use 99% alcohol is because it evaporates so fast, anything that you're trying to kill or apply to will not intake and will not die. 70% is just slower. 80 is like the most effective number for evaporation, so quick getting rid of, but also the most penetrative. So it gets inside and kills everything.
So we brew, and we use star sand for sterilization.
Oh yeah.
Is that can you use that?
Again, and you can sterilize anything that you sterilize ahead of time, you can use whatever you want. Alcohol is if you're going to be doing stuff immediately because it evaporates and it gets out of your way right after it kills stuff. So it's just the most effective way to do things. And again, you know, the 80%, that's important. Anything under 80 is fine. And 90%, you know, again, it's better than nothing. Any alcohol is better than nothing. You just have to kind of get your head around how effectively it kills and immediately it kills. So again, we put everything that's been pre-sterilized, pressure cooked, covered with alcohol, loaded up into this box, and then we shut the caps on here. And so now everything in here is sterile and ready for us to do transfers. Okay? And so we're going to get back to that. We're going to show some of the stuff. Does anybody have any basic knowledge on spores versus mycelium or active cultures? Anybody know the difference? Has anybody ever bought spores? Has anybody ever bought a liquid culture? Okay, so typically at home, there's a few ways to start your growing process. So you can buy spore syringes. You can get spore prints from wild mushrooms or any kind of fresh mushroom that you have. Or typically you can buy a culture, which is already germinated spores that have actively started growing. So spores would be akin to the seed of a tomato plant. An active culture would be the tomato plant itself. Okay? So when you have an active culture, especially if it's one from somebody who has done all of the work, isolated it, and grown it out very specifically, you know exactly what you're going to grow every time. So this is what they call a king blue oyster. We have a culture that's on a petri dish. Every time we go to produce this, it will look exactly like this. Now, if we took some of this right here, we took a little piece off of this fresh mushroom. Underneath are all the gills for here. That's the reproductive organ. So the body of the mushroom, the mycelium, is inside of this bag. The sawdust that it's been digesting has given it all of its food source. And then we have turned it into the intention of growing the mushroom by changing its environment. So we produce the mushroom. So now we can take one of these, put it on a piece of tin foil, and collect spores. So this is still the same king blue oyster, right? If we took some of those spores, put them on a petri dish and started our growing process, our petri dish grew out just fine. We transferred it to grain. We transferred it to our bulk media, and we fruited it in exactly the same conditions. We could get a million different variations in what this would look like. And so that's the same idea from going from spore is taking a handful of tomato seeds from every packet of heirloom tomatoes you've ever grown and putting them in the ground and expecting a purple Cherokee tomato. It will never happen unless you have that culture of that specific one. So people often ask me, spores versus culture. Unless you are intending on doing a one-time grow, or you are intending on trying to isolate your own culture, spores are the very beginning process that are going to be more random as far as what the product is. Now, for different varieties of mushrooms, it almost never matters. Some varieties, like psilocybin mushrooms, are poplar mushrooms, and a few other varieties will almost grow the same mushroom consistently. Now, some mushrooms like shiitakes are the most genetic divergent for whatever reason. You can never grow a similar style shiitake from a spore from that same mushroom. So it's their survival mechanism for whatever reason. Every time they produce spores, they try to better themselves, better their environment. But if you have a culture, you can keep your culture alive, you can keep it fresh, active, and clean if you learn how to keep it and use it and transfer it in sterile conditions. So, buy your spore syringe, collect your culture, keep your culture. That's my recommendation. Now, if you want to start over with a new variety of mushrooms, get another spore syringe. Start the process over. But you'll see, and we'll go through it. When you do start your spore syringe, we're going to go on to an agar plate, and we're also going to go into a media. The agar plates will always be your backup plan. This will be a way to save your work wherever you're at. And you'll know, once you start growing mushrooms enough, it is easy to fail. This is, if you learn anything, keeping cultures is probably the most important. Growing mushrooms is the easy part. This is the hard part. Any questions yet? Difference between spores, cultures, yeah?
So if you get the spores off of, let's say, the king oyster that you were talking about, and you grew it and it was different, does it change like how edible they are, or does it change?
So it will still be a king oyster mushroom. It is now genetically different. So before, we could take this mushroom here, put them on a petri dish, and they would fuse together. They will no longer do that, but they are still the same species. Now, the only difference might be a 5-degree fruiting temperature difference. So let's say the one you just now started doesn't fruit anything under 62 degrees, which is colder than you can make any of your growing environments. And this one goes at 65 degrees. That could be the only difference. But you'll never know until you go through all of the work of growing from petri into fruiting body, which is usually a 6-month to a 1-year process for a majority of the time, especially if you're paying more attention to your culture than just trying to grow a mushroom. So it can take a while to sit there. And that's why, usually when you buy cultures, they're expensive. Every one we buy is almost $300 to $400, if you get it from Aloha Medicinals or something, and they send you 2 copies of it, and that's it. That's what they give you. But in theory, we have some that we've been working with for 10 years, and we've lost some along the way. We've contaminated part of them along the way, but for the most part, we have cultures that we've been working with pretty consistently and have never diverged from their genetic intention.
And with the petri dish, after it's grown out with mycelium, am I looking for a certain thing on the petri dish?
Yeah, so most often than not, especially if you're starting from spore, regardless, all mycelial growth is in a radial pattern. Okay, they are an omnidirectional grower. There is not one spherical direction they cannot send out mycelium. Now, it's all based on growing conditions. So if you put it on a 2-dimensional surface like this, it's just going to grow in a radial pattern. So what you're looking for when you have a successful culture or you start one is to take from the tips of all of the growth. So, and we'll go through a little bit more of that when we start doing some of the transfers. But things you can look for to know your culture is healthy and taking is consistent radial growth. So if you see one side just growing real hard in one direction, but nothing else growing, there's an issue there. There could be a contamination. There could be just one very aggressive spore that germinated that is your go-to to look for. So there's several different things, especially when you're looking at a petri dish, but usually uniform, clean, white, healthy growth. And then if you are making transfers, you always try to go to the edge of the growth. That will be the most active part of its growing intentions. So all mycelium grows from a tip. They're called hyphal tips. And so those hyphae is what grow out in all directions, searching for food, nutrients, appropriate environment. And so everything, the brain of the mushroom always focuses all of its intent and energy on the newest part of its growth.
If you notice like a spot on there that could potentially be contaminated, is there a way to salvage?
There is. And just like anything, at that point, you're taking the risk. So your mycelium will always be clean, white, fuzzy looking, but if you have this little tiny speck over here that's a slight shade of green, that's on there, and the potential for you to have a little bit of that on any of your culture is now exponentially greater. Now, if you are very good in the lab and you get very good at doing transfers, we've done it successfully enough out at the farm, with our setup that you can clean up plates. And there are even medicated plates that have like an antibiotic that will stifle some mold growths and some bacterial. Bacterial is usually the biggest issue, but will stifle some of that growth and just encourage your culture to grow. So even if you do potentially contaminate some of your culture, you could still absolutely try to save it. But there's got to be that thought in the back of your head that if 6 months from now, like everything is failing, that's because you took the risk of transferring that potentially contaminated media. And that's one of the hardest lessons to learn too in mushroom cultivation. Oftentimes, especially in the very beginning processes, it is nearly impossible without microscopy to see if you're perpetuating contamination. Small spores of trichoderma mold could be right here. You'd never know it. It hasn't germinated because its conditions aren't ideal yet, but yet you take your scalpel and you cut a little piece of this and you transfer it into your next grain bag. Well, your mushroom mycelium colonizes all of this, but now there's 1,000 times more trichoderma mold spores that still have not germinated in here that you still have no idea are in here. And so then you go and you perpetuate it to $300 worth of substrate. And you incubate that for a week, and now you're finally seeing your contamination. And so in addition to really paying attention to your initial growing environment transfers is data tracking, because especially if you start making multiple plates to like make multiple grain spawn bags and grow your mushrooms out, if you have an issue with this grain spawn or with this final substrate, you have to be able to find where your initial culture started from. So if you don't have a way to identify, okay, on 6:30 I transferred from grain to bulk, and then on 5:30 I transferred from Petri to grain, and this was grain 5B7 that's of oyster mushroom, you'll sit here and you'll perpetuate that contamination and never know where it comes from. So again, the initial part of mushroom growing is the hardest part, and this is where it's very important to be clean and organized.
Let's say I'm working with liquid culture,
Mhm.
and so there's a sterile liquid, and the culture's in this jar. Is that mycelium or hyphae? So I've got this jar, and it looks like something's growing on top of the culture.
Yeah, kind of like a SCOBY, like for kombucha or something.
No,
Or
it's white.
white.
And it's
Good.
got like arms.
Yeah.
Do you think that's hyphae or is that a contaminant?
Yeah, it absolutely is. Yeah, and it really depends on what it is. More often than not, if it's white, it's usually fine. And the mycelium struggles in liquid culture to kind of establish a platform, so it will double up and look almost ropey, kind of like spider webby on top of jars like that. But usually, as long as it's still white and not any other color, and it hasn't gone completely cloudy, it's fine.
Is there a format for stress testing?
It,
From the other end to say, from each step as you're adding it to go, I'm gonna stress this to C before I go to the next step?
100%. And so that's kind of one of the points that I'll make when we do our transfers. Being redundant and excessive with things that are relatively cheap, like agar plates, to check every step of your transfer is always a good idea, because that will save you time and effort. And in theory, you could stress test at several different, like heat-wise, dryness, or anything on a smaller scale in a media container like this. And especially, we do quality control tests every time we process substrate of any different media. We just played it on Agar. And it'll show you faster, it'll germinate competitive mold spores faster. But what it'll also do is allow you a small sampling of it to put in any kind of environment. Okay, so is anybody familiar with the term spawn? So spawn is basically a vehicle to transfer our mycelium. So after we've successfully used our spore syringe or our liquid culture, we've transferred it to a Petri dish. We see a good, healthy color on here. We see good active growth. Now we're going to take this Petri dish culture that we are pretty encouraged with, and we're going to transfer it to a grain media. So what that does is it allows for expansion of that mycelium and an additional food source. So what we do is we sterilize all of our grain in these bags, and then in our still air box, we'll take just a few tiny little pieces of this culture. It doesn't take much, about 3 to 5 little chunks, and we'll drop it inside of this bag here. Now these bags will incubate, and you can see all of this mycelium is starting to coat every one of these seeds now. So now we've gone off of the Petri dish, and we have thousands of seeds that are all coated with this mycelium now. Every one of these could be transferred to a new Petri dish as a redundant culture storage setup. Every one of these, we could take a little piece after this grows, put it on a Petri dish to see if it's contaminated. Or now, once this is all coated, we could take this one bag of grain and spread it to 10 bags of grain. So now we're expanding our culture again. So if we had 10 bags of grain, those 10 bags are now able to inoculate 10 bags of our final substrate. So there is no reason not to expand. There's also no reason to. You could just take this one bag and go straight into one bag of media, and that's all you need to do. This, what spawn allows you to do, especially from our standpoint as a consistent producer, we produce weekly, is this allows for a weekly supply of our culture without having to go all the way back to Petri dish. So spawn, these spawn bags, once you fully colonize this, you can store this for months. This is media that is a backup plan. You can make excessive amounts just in case you need it, or you could just let it get a little bit too old to spread to your next level, and you can just fruit right from your spawn. Your spawn is usually enough nutrition of a source that you could grow your mushrooms. So say you make 10 bags, you only ever used 8, and the other 2 are just getting too old in the fridge. Cut them open, put them in your grow room. They'll still grow mushrooms about the same. So after our spawn is made, that's when we go to our final substrate. So more often than not, you either have a primary decomposing variety of mushrooms, which would be the first on the scene to start digesting tree, wood, log, anything made out of cellulose or lignin, okay? Anything that is a very freshly killed or recently killed plant are primary decomposers, first food source. Primary decomposer examples: oyster mushrooms, poplar mushrooms, king oyster mushrooms, lion's mane mushrooms. Basically anything that you see when you walk through the woods that is growing off a tree or a log. So, wood ears, anything along those lines. Secondary decomposers. So what these need is plant-based material that has been partially digested, fermented, or otherwise added bacteria to it. So imagine a cow or a horse is out in the field, they're sitting there, they're eating grass, they're chewing on it, goes through their gut just like ours, they're picking up beneficial bacteria that help break down, denature some of that cellulose and lignin. it's getting processed, and then it gets left as poop. Okay, well, secondary decomposers, this is their wheelhouse, because as they germinate on that moisture substrate, and then they actually need those beneficial bacteria that are gained from. So that's why manure-based substrate is used for secondary decomposers. Wood-based, hardwood-based substrate is used for primary decomposers. There are other varieties out there called mycorrhizal varieties, such as morels, truffles, chanterelles, basically any of the mushrooms that are not cultivatable because of the fact that they start their life cycle with a host plant. So all of those varieties, you know, morels, people wonder why you can never just sit there and grow them in a big factory. Well, it's because they have to have this relationship at the mycorrhizal sphere of plants in order to gain and grow to a certain size. Now, with morels specifically, once they've established that host, gained, digested enough nutrients, exchanged with this tree, they will start forming reproductive parts called sclerotia. So they're basically these bald, knotted hyphae that grow that will be their reproductive source. So once it rains, it's cool, maybe that tree dies. The body of the mycelium now says, all right, this host relationship is done, we have to reproduce. So as soon as conditions are favorable, springtime for morels, lots of rain comes, it starts to warm up, ground temperature hits 55 degrees, all of a sudden those sclerotia start to activate, and then boom, up come the mushrooms from there. Truffles are basically a similar thing, except they don't produce a fruiting body. It is the fruiting body, spores are produced internally. But that's why you cannot just sit there and cultivate certain varieties of mushrooms also. Now, with truffles and things like that, people have learned that if you take baby plants, one-year-old trees that are known to be hosts for them, and you make a slurry from a petri dish that is basically a liquid culture, you can now take those roots of those plants and dip them in and plant a field out. So now what you've done is you have made sure that the cultures that have natural hosts that you have introduced them to, and you are encouraging, not necessarily cultivating, certain varieties of mycorrhizal fungi. And that's where truffle farms do. Nobody's done it with morels, nobody has done it with chanterelles, and I would just assume it's just not worth it. But for no reason, if you wanted to at home, you could absolutely go buy a baby pine tree, go find some fresh chanterelles out in the woods, make a puree, stick it in there, and you might grow some. You know, so anyway, that's the difference between final substrate. So wood-based primary decomposers, more often thought of as the culinary mushrooms, aside from secondary decomposers like portobellas and button mushrooms. Any questions, Jen?
You mentioned using the still air box
Mhm.
and adding things to the bag. You're not injecting with an injection fork. You're opening the bag and you have a sealer in the still air box?
We have these very cool bag clips that are reusable, but you can, at the farm, we use a sealer. So we just have a heat sealer. But if you're working in a still air box, you have to sit here and wrap your head around how to load everything you're possibly going to use in one session in this box without ever coming back out of it. And that's where those bag clips come in handy. And the same mentality, and we'll get into it here in a minute. When you load these boxes, you have to be very specific, and you have to have a very well thought out motion and plan of action, because once you get in there and expose your media to the open air, if you forget your scissors and you have to take your arms out of that hole, you might as well consider most of everything you've just done a waste.
Can you flame a needle in the still air box?
It's not recommended if you're using alcohol. And so, which case, again, you have to really wrap your head around how to prepare those syringes to bag up to load in here. And I'll talk about it a little bit. That's why without and you can specifically, if you do what they call like flame sessions or whatever, where you're going to have a little little burner in there, and then you, without cleaning it, use a different cleaner, use hydrogen peroxide, and you go through and you will flame sterilize every scalpel, every syringe, you will load it into sterilized tinfoil that you spray in alcohol. You wrap those up. You spray the outside of the tinfoil. You load those into your Ziploc bags that then get sprayed with alcohol, and then that's what we have loaded in here. That's how dirty you have to assume everything is. We have medical grade lab supply that we still clean. Just because. I mean, the thought of ruining all of this work for not doing one little step like that, it hurts.
Question. Do you guys like shower before you go into work? And
So
stuff
we
like that,
don't.
no?
We're not. We've learned over the years exactly like how and when. So typically, if we have a big lab production day, that will be the first task, and we will prioritize things like Petri dish working first, and then grain spawn. So there are levels of thought of how clean you absolutely have to be. But we basically we wear hairnets, face masks. We have lab coat gowns that we recommend they usually use, unless she comes in like right off the bat. And then it's kind of like, you know, if you clean shower, then you douse yourself with alcohol. So arms, chest, you know, as much as you can tolerate without it being super irritant. But that's the redundancy. You know, a gallon of alcohol costs $10, and you know that lasts you several lab sessions. So be sloppy with it. There's no wrong reason. But I used to wear a bunny suit. You know, I used to shower. I used to go straight into the lab. I'd put on my bunny suit. I'd wipe that whole thing down. I mean, again, there's really yeah, you bet. There's no wrong assumption that everything you're doing is filthy. And when you start getting into mycology and you learn about like clean room space, you know, clean rooms are used in any kind of biological production. So, you know, when they're making vaccines for COVID, computer chip production, you know, but there are different levels. So there's a level million clean room, which might be about what we're at. A million means there's a million parts, not a million, I'm sorry, 100,000. A million would be a million parts per million in the air. So that would be completely dusty, obviously everywhere. Ours is probably 100,000 parts per million is how clean our air gets. So we have a sterile HEPA filter system that constantly runs and scrubs the air. We don't use sterile air boxes there. So we work in front of this laminar flow hood that basically pushes a flow of 99.9% filtered air. So every time we open a container, it's all done in front of that. But even still, even with that sterile air system, you still have to be very mindful of not reaching over open products or anything, and just always assuming that you're the dirtiest part of whatever's about to happen. All right, I think we're gonna start getting into some of the air box, unless anybody has any other questions on like the basic life cycle. I mean, did you guys kind of get the idea of spore versus culture? We're gonna kind of take that culture and keep moving. Go ahead.
What's the timeline? Like, so your spores to the agar?
And you know, so typically if you were to put 2 drops of a spore syringe onto this plate, you won't see any growth for at least a week. You won't have any growth far enough along for at least 2 weeks after that to be able to transfer. Or if you take a culture from this plate that's already established and go to a complete other plate, that's about a 2-week process because the culture is used to that agar. And so you can usually assume a solid month from the time you initiate to the time you can make any transfer with agar. Now, once you take some of that agar into grain, that's very specific on the variety, but on average, it's still another 3 to 4 weeks until this grain master would be ready. So right now we're at about 2 months. So from this grain master, if we were to make 2nd generation grain spawn, which we make 3rd generation grain spawn at the farm, if we were to make 2nd generation, that goes a little faster. The mycelium's used to this grain. We're going from the grain it's used to just more of it. That takes about a week to 2 weeks, depending on the variety. And so now that we've finally got spawn ready to go to our bulk substrate, again, it's very strain specific, but on average, our oyster mushrooms take about 10 days. Our shiitakes age for 8 weeks. So if we start a shiitake, a brand new culture, from plate and to actually harvesting the mushroom takes 6 months.
What type of grain do you use?
We use a variety, to be honest, and because of how crazy the market and everything is, it's mostly price driven. But that said, I prefer millet or milo, which we have recently switched to, because of its size. So per volume, you get more grain, which gives you more contact points when you transfer it. And that's what you're looking for. Something the size of a sunflower seed has almost the same amount of contact potential as something the size of a piece of millet. Now you could fit almost 20 grains of millet in a sunflower seed. So that's the mentality. It's good.
Do different grains, mushrooms prefer different grains?
And they do, and honestly, we haven't found any that absolutely hate any of them. We notice a slower growth sometimes. And the hardest thing, especially when you're buying grain from like a feed store, is to consider how dirty that grain is batch to batch. So we could go 3 months using millet from the same store and it'd be great. And that's because it's from the prior harvest. And then we go and pick up a new batch of millet that was just harvested. And let's say the humidity is hot or high, it was hot. And so now that same millet has almost 10 to 1,000 times the initial mold spore content as the grain before. And there's almost no way to know that unless you put that grain onto a petri dish plate to germinate, to attempt to see the contaminants that are on it. So we assume a certain level of contamination in all of our grain, and that's why when we process and soak, we put things like hydrogen peroxide in the water. So it helps kind of sterilize before we put them into our pressure cookers even. And just to slough off any kind of ambient contaminant, yeast, mold, bacteria that's on here as is.
The shiitake, saying it's an 8 week or 8 weeks, is that something that is because of the environment and because of all this? Like if you were to grow it somewhere else, it might be a faster process, or is this just across the board?
It's typically 6 to 8 weeks for almost any strain. Shiitakes have one of the most available strain selection, so like a catalog basically. Now, our 8-week strain produces the best for us at 8 weeks. We can put that in our grow room at 6 weeks and harvest half as much mushroom in the first couple harvests. So it's more or less giving the strain enough time to digest the nutrients and prepare itself as best you can. So again, you run into issues with storage at that point. So like you've seen our incubation room out at the farm, you know how full that thing can get. Well, if we only grew shiitakes, we would now need 10 times as much space, as opposed to growing things that only turn over in 2 weeks. So, and even looking at the catalogs, we could choose a 6-week strain that produces almost as good as our 8-week strain, but it hates the heat. So there's all of these variables. Again, it's a lot like growing tomatoes. Do you want to eat cherry, these little 100s and pick all of those constantly? Well, they produce, they sell, they're good tomatoes, but you want something else, that's more specific. And even more specific to that, there are shiitake varieties that grow very good with indoor production like we do, and there are ones that are very suited for outdoor log production, which is a more traditional style. So there's different things. Some varieties of mushrooms are so new that there's almost no choice in the matter. You get what you get, and you just kind of learn how to grow it. Now, like I said, the shiitake, since they've been cultivated a lot longer, have a big category, catalog that you can choose based on your growing environment specifics and stuff like that. So if you were just trying to turn over as many as you can, you'd choose the 6-week strain and just push out more faster. But we want better use of our space, so we go with an 8-week, heavier producer.
When you talk about the woods, if you have you noticed a difference of taste or yields with certain woods?
Yeah, taste would be tough. Taste, and I would say that there's never been a time where if the mycelium grows a mushroom, it will always have the same flavor and nutritional content, because they will not do it if they cannot. Now, again, that's also certain woods will not grow. Like you don't want to use pines. You don't want to use softwoods because they have natural antifungal properties. They claim white oak sawdust is the prime food source for almost any primary decomposer. And I don't know that anybody's actually really got specific as far as it could just be that the lignin is easier to digest. It's a lot of things. The heartwood is hardier. So there's a lot of reasons. We buy a blended hardwood pellet that varies from manufacturer, and we do see inconsistencies if we have to switch brands sometimes. And that could be because this one is 80% elm wood versus 80% oak wood. So, yes, there is a difference in substrate.
You said oak was the preferred usually?
Yeah, I mean, across the board, I have yet to hear any other opinion. So if you can buy hardwood pellets that are oak specific, and some places do sell that, that's usually the best. The only ones you want to avoid would be going to like an animal or store and looking for pine pellets. Just avoid anything pine. It has to be hardwood. Mm-hmm.
So we were talking about our brew grains.
Oh, yeah.
Would that be the grain? Would we use that for the grain instead?
And so remember how we were talking about the nutritional content too. So again, something to consider when you are perpetuating from spawn to bulk is how much spawn you need to how much bulk substrate. We, with as well as we can keep our environment clean, we spawn at 2%. So this is a 5.5 pound bag. 1/2 cup by volume of this grain spawn is about 2% of the weight of this. That's a minimum. That's like an industrial farm minimum. Home spawn rates are typically 10%. And the higher the spawn rate, the faster your mycelium will establish, the faster it will outcompete potential contaminants. So there's really no wrong amount of spawn to go to your final substrate unless it's a variety of mushroom that does not like overly nutritious media. So our shiitake mushrooms will actually grow worse the richer their substrate is. So if we were to use like spent brewer's grain as a supplement in addition, for our shiitake mushrooms, we would only be able to use about 10% of that brewer's grain for the total weight. Now, if for our oyster mushrooms or the king oysters, they are huge digesters, they're fast, they'll rip through all that. You could use closer to 50% and still be fine. The more nutritious your substrate is, the more nutritious it is for every other thing that you are not trying to grow. So you could easily put too much nitrogen in there that the small amount of trichodermin that is in this bag finds and outcompetes your oyster mushrooms and will ruin your whole batch. So there is a tipping point, and that's why, coffee grounds, all of this free stuff that is all plant-based is great additives. You just have to have a little bit more understanding of how rich and how some of your media and mushroom varieties will grow and react to it. Anybody else? You guys want to see me do some stuff in the airbox now?
Yes.
Cool. This isn't going to be great. This is not ideal as far as like me hunching over. Hopefully you guys can see everything in here well enough. But we're going to go through and talk about the importance of procedure more or less than watching me do a lot of this. And I'm just going to try to highlight things to avoid and things to really pay attention to in order to not contaminate stuff. Okay, so still airbox design can be very, very, very basic, okay? You don't even need like these PVC portholes in here. I prefer something that I can load all my material in, take my alcohol, spray it in here, close it up, and let it sit for a couple minutes. So what that will do is it will settle all of the air in here, okay? The alcohol hopefully kind of helps bring everything down, but what you don't want is up top here when you're putting the lid on or putting your arms back in for there to be air that has not had any sort of treatment. Lysol is a good product because it is such a fine aerosol to just sit there and spray in here. But basically, you want to fume this box with all of your media in here the best you can to assure that almost any kind of airborne contaminant has been touched by that alcohol vapor. That's the idea. Let it settle. So now everything in here, the air and the media that you're working with has all been cleaned and sterilized, okay? And so to go through all of that work, it's also very important to pre-plan and prep all of your stuff. Because like I said, the last thing you want to do is to go through all of these months and weeks of preparation of creating this culture for something as stupid as needing another glove to take your arm out and contaminate everything. It's a hard, hard lesson to learn. So you can see all of these different bags are labeled syringe to grain to agar. It's got gloves in here. It's got parafilm. It's got Petri dishes. We've got our sterilized syringe in here. Like we were talking about, pre-flamed, pre-sterilized and loaded in here, so we don't have to worry about any of that. And that's what we will start with. So we're going to take everything else out of here. These are all for other.
Do you sterilize those in the container when you pack up?
Yes. So, okay. So when we're loading this, the best place, would be a nightmare situation to try to do mycology in for real. Pick somewhere that's relatively calm. I used to do it in my kitchen, which wasn't terrible, and then I moved downstairs to like a little space. Like if you have a grow tent, anywhere where you can be in a glove box while you're working in your glove box kind of idea is always the best. But like I said, I was successful enough doing it in my kitchen with my kids running around me often enough. So as long as your method, once you're in there, nothing else can distract you from that. You know, make sure you're set up, you're in there to do what you got to do, and then it can be literally. You guys will see some of this stuff. It takes 3 minutes. The preparation of getting everything there and clean and sterile is what takes time. It's what you really have to wrap your head around, the sterility and cleanliness of everything. So everything we put in here. Syringe, grain, agar, plate. Okay, so what we are going to demonstrate here with this process is we're going to take our syringe. This is a liquid culture syringe that we made of our oysters. This could easily be applied to a spore syringe, okay? It's the same idea, but remember when we talked about the difference between spore and culture. Spores on the Petri dish plate will be fine, okay? Spores, when we go to our bulk media, will be much more of a gamble, okay? Because now we're shooting spores into grain media that they've never seen before. Those spores haven't germinated. They haven't started forming hyphae. Chances are there's a very good chance those spores will germinate. Now, if you're growing something super exotic that is known to be finicky, it probably will never do anything. If you're growing something like oyster mushrooms, you could shoot that spore in there from across the room and chances are they'll be fine. So it's a matter of knowing which variety you're working with, but you just always want to err on the side of being overly clean and overly processed. So we're going to go ahead and spray down all of our bags. I'm mostly just kind of cleaning up the bags right now. Yep, and then.
Normally you would do it inside the box.
So this is exactly how I would approach this.
okay.
So I'm gonna spray these down first. I'm gonna spray them again, and they're gonna get sprayed again before we even open them.
Yeah.
So.
Totally.
So this is everything that we need for this initial process. Okay, like I said, syringe, petri dish, grain media, gloves, a way to seal up the petri dish again called parafilm. There's a bag clip in here that we've already thought about that this bag might need. Actually, we won't need it because of the spore syringe. But anyway, always better off to have extra stuff in here that is clean and ready to go than to not have it. So. Making sure to get the top, sides. Honestly, if I were to do it again, I wouldn't buy this box because of these wheels and stuff on here. There's a small air gap, I think, in there that we tried to silicone seal. But you can even make your own out of just plexiglass. You know, it just all depends on how much you want to do this. And then eventually everybody will buy a laminar flow hood, which is a little filter system to work in front of, and you won't ever go back into this glove box again. Oops, see, I already forgot, need alcohol in there. All right, so everything's loaded in here. Armholes are open for now. Now we go back in here. Spray everything again. Now you can easily just use a paper towel with alcohol, wipe everything down. Again, it all depends on your glove box setup. All right, so we're just gonna give that a chance to kind of hang out and sit for a second. Doesn't take much time. Usually that alcohol, especially if you're using an 80%, vaporizes and kind of mixes in with everything, but really just kind of letting everything just chill out and hang here for a minute. Spray ourselves down real good. All right. So in our kit for this, we have our petri dish and a piece of parafilm. So parafilm is just like this plastic-like stretchy tape that is used to seal up petri dishes. You can kind of stretch it, wrap it around it. It's almost like waxy. It allows some air to breathe, but not a ton. Our petri dish is in there. Gloves, obviously always put a couple extra pairs of gloves, you know, with whatever you're doing. Paper towels, so don't put a roll of paper towels in here. I mean, God only knows what's on paper towels. I get more. It's just little things like that that people just don't think about, that they'll snap off 12 pieces of a paper towel and put them in here. Spray your paper towels with alcohol. You know, even if you want dry paper towels, they'll dry out. Lysol wipes, again, probably a redundancy, but our lab professionals are very, very proficient. So, our syringe, probably the more important thing, and then our bag clip. So I was a chef for about 12 years, and I did a lot of competitions. So this is what, in the culinary world, they consider mise en place, which means everything in its place. Okay, so to make your life as easy as possible, put as much thought into doing this before you even stick your hands in here. Run it through in your head. Figure out which hand you prefer to use to go from one side to another. Because once you open up this Petri dish, you need to work as quick as you can to do what you need to do and then get back, seal it up, and let it sit. Okay, least exposure, the better. So we are going to open up our bag. More alcohol. So, like I said, there's an order of importance here. If we've paid for this liquid culture syringe or this spore syringe, and we're trying to make a redundancy, a copy on Petri dish, and we're also going to send it to grain, which one would be more important? The Petri dish. So that is the one we will do first. That is the one that is, everything is as clean as it can be. We're going to go quick. We're going to open up that Petri dish. We're going to put a little bit of this in here. We're going to seal it up. And then we'll move on to doing the less successful potential, which would be the grain inoculation. So we're going to have our bag out, our syringe out, Petri dish, parafilm, ready to stretch. We're going to spray all of this in alcohol again. Okay? Alcohol can touch most mycelium and most spores and not hurt it for the most part at certain volumes. If it's a tiny amount, you will get rid of it. If there is any residual alcohol in your hand that goes in this Petri dish or happens to touch your liquid culture, it will not kill it right away. So don't worry about your hands being a little extra wet with alcohol or anything along those lines. Of course, putting on gloves with wet hands is never easy. But this will be quick, so it won't matter too much. All right. So we're going to take the cap off. Oops. Cap off our syringe. We're spraying our hands. We're spraying everything again because we're getting ready to open this up. Okay. So, always assume your hands, everything that's in your hands, everything around you is dirty. So we are going to hold this up. Oops. Oh, she's got parafilm on here. We're going to open it up with the lid away from us to the best of our ability. And we're just going to drop a couple drops of this on here. Oops. We're going to shut it. We're going to put our needle down. We're going to take our parafilm and we're going to rewrap this plate. Oops. Okay, so now we've got our culture on our plate. We're going to set that aside. Pick up our syringe again. A little redundancy. We're going to take our bag of grain, quick shot through the port, let it all loose in there, pull it out. Another quick shot with alcohol. Okay? Come on out. So, you can see everything we've transferred is completely sealed. Nothing should interrupt its sterility after we open up the lid again. More often than not, you're never going to just do one plate. If I were doing this for real, that would have at least been 5 plates that we would have shot to at first. And then everything else would have gone to at least one bag of grain, if not multiple. Okay, use your room, the amount of space you have, you could see how fast that goes. But don't crowd this so full that now you're making mistakes. Okay, it's more important to get these initial cultures. Anything you do that's a Petri dish, put priority on. Okay. So again, now, inoculated, ready to go. Our liquid culture is in here. This is now a grain master, a GM. This will be the very first. We'll date it, we'll label it. And now, in about 2 to 3 weeks, once this is fully colonized, we'll take this and we'll transfer it to 5 bags of larger grain and make more spawn. Okay, so that's done with. Now our Petri dish, we have a backup of this culture that we just paid for. Again, in theory, we should have 5 plates. Okay, 4 of them go bad, at least 1 of them made it. Okay, we have our culture now. This is our master culture. Okay, when you label these Petri dishes, it's very important to remember where your master culture came from and any expansive cultures after that. It's all about data tracking. It's all about going back to your initial, okay? So the more you can remember to kind of tag, note, make some kind of how you expanded it. Again, if something happens where we contaminate an entire batch of oyster mushrooms in our bulk substrate, we need to be able to find this master culture and figure out why. Any questions about the, yep?
Did you end up using the backlit?
I didn't. She packed that in there. We didn't need it. That would have been if this bag wasn't sealed or if we weren't going to make use the injection port. And if we were to use a scalpel and take from a culture and transfer in there, then we would need the bag clip to seal our bag for our, and that's how we do all of our perpetuation out at the farm. Everything is done from Petri dish with scalpel into bag. We never use syringes for anything because of the exponential potential for syringes to contaminate. It's easy for us to know this, the scalpel is sterile. We can sterilize in front of our flow hood system and stuff, but that's the idea. So we'll clean all of this up and then we'll load up the next round, which would be, after your culture is established, after your grain's established.
Question?
Yep.
I might have missed this. Do you sterilize the needle?
So we did talk about flaming and flame sterilization, and so that is something that you should do before you load it into your kit, before it goes into your glove box. Now, what people will do will load several things that need to be flamed and use an alternative cleaning solution as opposed to alcohol in here. You just never want to mix, the flame with alcohol, obviously. So these, you can very cleanly flame it, have a piece of aluminum foil that has paper towel soaked in alcohol, flame it, wrap it up, spray it real good, and just consider that. Again, this is why we don't use syringes. There's an exponential, but to buy new cultures and things, you don't have much choice. So.
Now, do you do also the scalpel at that time?
Yes. So if we were to load up we would sterilize all of our scalpels at one time. We would flame all of our needles at one time. We would flame all of our inoculation loops that we use to transfer, anything like that that is metal. And that is after they've been sterilized to the best of their ability. So you can use, buy lock lure syringes and get completely sterile fresh out of the package, which is usually a good alternative, but even still, you still want to spray down with alcohol and everything.
Let's say you've got maybe 5 plates in there and a dozen jars of grain spawn. And you're going to use a scalpel to drop some agar into those. Would you use the same scalpel, just flamed and sterilized once?
Sure.
Spray it with alcohol then?
If it is all the same culture that you're transferring,
Yeah.
and you're going in and out of the same one, it's usually fine.
Fine, okay.
You know, and again, that's a discretionary thing. There's nothing to say you shouldn't have a separate scalpel for every time you.
I don't need 5.
1,000%, and I don't either, and I've gotten away with it. But at the same time, you know, there's never too clean. But when we do this, we've got like 3 different scalpels loaded in here. They're all, you know, you can get the one-time use, really cheap ones that are kind of pre-sterilized, open up and use it. But if it's a culture that you've worked with and everything, there's usually nothing wrong. As long as you at least spray with alcohol in between transfers, that's usually enough. And you don't want, you know, like a big chunk of something on your scalpel, obviously. Try to keep it as clean as possible. That's usually enough. All right, so this time we are going to go from our established plate. So we're going to take this chicken of the woods culture that we use for our CO2 generator bags, and we are going to go to our grain media. So this one, we will be using the bag clip. We will be opening the top of this bag and inoculating that way, as opposed to the syringe method. Now, like I said, syringes are perfect for bringing in new cultures. After a while, you will learn to never want to use them again. And it's only because you can see potential contamination on plates, and it's less likely with sterilized scalpels. I think we got everything here. She got a bag clip in there. Yep.
Did you say you used a port itself, or are you just calling the plastic?
Oh no, all of our bags that we sell have injection ports on them.
Is it one where like you really should only be using it once kind of thing, like, or is it?
Yeah, these are definitely kind of a one and done. You know, it's basically just like a weather stripping or any kind of self-healing media that's on there. And this is on there from when we sterilize. So this is sterile until you touch the needle through it. And as long as your needle is sterile, you're all sterile, you're fine. Now your needle, again, biggest culprit. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, or going back in there. That's kind of a no-no. You know, it's once you put something in there, never again. All right, so plate to grain transfer. Again, we're going to be using our scalpel. We're going to be taking a small chunk of this active growing tip of the mycelium, and we're going to inoculate this bag of grain. It will then be sealed, and that's how we're going to produce this bag of grain master. And one other thing to say, one of these Petri dishes could easily inoculate a dozen bags of grain master. So there's no reason why you couldn't be doing more of this, just the same as spreading your syringe to more plates. We're just doing this for simplification reasons. Another important thing to remember, you know, especially if you're working with like multiple cultures at a time, or you're trying to do many preparations with a few things, is labeling. So having redundant labels, especially if you're using alcohol, obviously washes off Sharpie very easy. But if you're sitting here trying to do 3 different cultures in a syringe to go to grain master, and you make 5 plates each, and a grain spawn bag, and all you're doing is setting stuff aside over here to the side, have something labeled on the side of your box to where it's a destination to where you know each culture went. Have a way to identify it, because I guarantee you take 10 minutes away from that and you think you remember, it's never going to happen. We have grown more mixed mushroom bags because of 1 second of misplacement and a second guess, or this is probably a kind of idea. So again, the more set up, prepared, situated, even with things after you're done, to kind of make sure you're not mixing stuff up is pretty important. This glove box, I think, cost me like, I think the totes are pretty expensive now. I think it was probably maybe 50 bucks with everything. So, you know, $50 investment will let you do almost anything as far as mycology cultivation is concerned. Now, obviously, you're not going to be inoculating 1,000 pounds in here, otherwise you'll go crazy, but you get the idea. Basically, you can grow any mushroom you want aside from morels and truffles in here. I started a mushroom farm in a glove box. I promise you, it works. All right, going back in. I should even be wiping this thing down. Clunk. All right, so we're gonna spray down all of our media bags again. So you can see, you know, this is labeled. This is not just labeled with its name. This has its date that we started it. This has where it came from. This has all kinds of information on it. So to sit here and spray this with alcohol and not have any other way to know what this was, and you just try to use your memory, is not a good idea. Have a piece of paper, have all this stuff written down on it at the very least. Don't use wax. I mean, a lot of people use those wax crayons in labs and stuff like that, and those work pretty good. See, this is sealed. If you were to do this at home, you would not pre-seal your bags. So this is already sealed, and because of that, I'm just going to cut the seal open. Now, obviously, there's no way to reseal this bag unless you have bag clips in a sterile situation, even if you have an electric sealer. So have to consider that. So we're going to set that aside. Got our syringe. This is our bag clip, which I'll show. Are you guys familiar with those bag clips at all? Okay, I'll show you a little bit more in detail. You can get them from a couple different places. There's a few different varieties. But basically, it's just like a U-shaped channel that's got a small piece of plastic tubing that fits almost perfectly in there that you just snap around the bag that makes an airtight seal. So these you can sterilize, you can reuse. This basically helps you to not either use jars and use bags or have a bag sealer. Okay, I'm sorry. We're gonna all pretend that I'm putting gloves on. Yeah, good. Okay, so when working with bags, jars, whatever you're about to prepare, make sure the lid is just barely on there, but still on there. Make sure your bags are at a point to where you don't have to sit here and unfold it and fumble with it. Make sure you can get in and out of whatever you're about to open as quick as possible. So I'm just going to give this a quick kind of open. I'm going to lay it down here on its side. So now we're going to spray down our culture real good. Okay, we're losing all of our words on there. We're going to take off the parafilm. Okay, and we're going to set that down. That's prepped and ready. We're going to get our scalpel. Spray, spray, spray. So these are the disposable scalpels I talked to you about. They're not too expensive. They're great if you're just doing kind of small one-time transfers. You don't have to worry about flaming it ahead of time because they come pre-hermetically sealed for medical use. So basically you take it out of the package, but even though they said they sterilized it, I'm still going to spray it with alcohol. We're going to take our scalpel out. Okay, so again, working with any kind of culture or anything that we open, we want to consider ourselves the dirtiest thing possible. So what I'm not going to do is open this up, reach around it, hover over the top of it, or basically try to put my skin anywhere above this plate. I'm going to come at it from the side, from the tip of my scalpel as best I can. I'm going to remove a small piece, put the lid right back on, and set it back down. And then we're going to take that piece and transfer it. Okay? In theory, you can open these plates and reuse them. In practice, it's not a good idea. Once you open a culture plate, you should really be prepared to not use it ever again, except for keeping it as backup as an emergency situation. This is why it's important to make multiple plates. You know, having a refrigerator full of Petri dishes costs you next to nothing, and it's an insurance program. Okay, so again, we're going to make sure our bag's primed and ready, open. We're going to take our dish open, set our lid down. We're going to take a little triangle-shaped wedge. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's not very big. We're going to take this wedge, flick it in there, take our culture, cover it back up, set that down. This is now the more time sensitive, is getting that agar in there clean. Take our bag clip, seal that up. Okay, so now our newly inoculated grain master is in a sterile situation. Now all we have to do is close back up our Petri dish, which we're not, I'm sorry, again, we're not closing our Petri dish. We don't need this, we've done its work, we're getting rid of it, okay? You do, you wanna, just as long as it's above the filter patch in there, so it can breathe, that's really all you need to consider. Okay, so this round of agar to grain master is finished. This was our goal, was to get a sterile piece of that culture via its agar in this grain, sealed. It's now ready to shake it up, and then this can sit and age for 3 weeks. Again, the chances are most of this culture is still fine and viable. The potential it's not is there. Proceed at your own risk.
What if you were going to start 5 or 6 grain masters?
Absolutely. Pull, yes. So what I would do at that point, if I would probably get as many as I could line up on the side here. So maybe 3 at a time. If you're working with jars at home, it's usually easier in a glove box than working with bags, but it's, you know, again, it's not impossible. And then just as quick, we would do order of operations. So how do we go farthest away from our body, least potential to contaminate, closest to us? So we would open up, we would work quick, we would drop in there, we'd come back, we would drop in here, we would drop in there, and then close, close, close.
Now, can you agar to agar?
Absolutely, 100%. And that's how we make all of our copies and everything. So again, once you have your syringe and you make your initial agar plate, or you make your initial 5 agar plates, which are all master agar plates, once you transfer from your master and you make 12 agar plates with that one master, those are all T1 plates now, first transfer plates. Okay, so those T1 plates are in theory what you would use for what I just did, for making your grain master. You never want to compromise your master plates for anything besides staying as master plates.
Say that again.
So So if we have our master culture here, we would only ever want to go to a T1 transfer to other agar plates with that. And then you go. Otherwise, like I said, if you want to seriously risk your one and only master culture or your 5 and only master cultures, that's fine. But there are a chance that you could unbeknowingly contaminate this and then sit there and perpetuate it for a long time.
Now, would you, if you needed more, let's say, children off that, you would go back to that? Do you go back to your master ever?
Absolutely. So when you really get into it, you make what's called master slants. And so those are test tubes that have a petri dish, and that's what you use your long-term storage for. So when we buy cultures, we get slants, and we make master plates from master slants once a year. And so from those 6 master plates we make one time a year, we make transfer plates from those, and that's all we ever have to do. That's how long you can transfer. And we grow hundreds of pounds a week. So just to give you an idea, there is almost no reason why you should ever have to contaminate your master, but you should always have redundant master copies that are untouched that could potentially make new ones.
How long again did you say for long-term storage?
If you've got a good enough freezer, you can usually keep stuff for years.
Is it fridge or freezer?
Either way. So if we store our slants in our refrigerator because we refresh them, but we keep a copy in the freezer as a long-term storage. So and I have redundancies at my farm and my house, just in case we lose power at the farm. Like, that's how, Yep. It's kind of like people's sourdough starters. Nobody ever wants to kill those for some reason. You can. The biggest thing is like with most home freezers, they go through like a thaw cycle and stuff. So, what you do is you actually compromise the agar in there, and sometimes it turns into like a slushy. That's why those test tubes, the 50, the big ones. Gosh, I can't remember the volume of it. And you pour agar in there, they keep from that happening a lot better than Petri dishes. So it's a better long-term storage alternative, and they're just as cheap. It's just a different thing to store them in. You can, in theory, never use Petri dishes and always use those tubes, but it's a lot harder to work with. All right, we are cruising along. All right, so our last transfer that we're going to do in the still air box is going from our grain that we have successfully inoculated and aged. So for this one, we are using, this is MMA2. That's our Maitake, our hen of the woods. So this is a grain master that we have, I would assume oh, here it is. You can see the little piece of agar that it initially came from. Every one of these grains is now coated with the body of the mycelium. So now we're going to go from grain to our final substrate, to our bulk substrate. So what we have in our bag here is a small agar plate. And now the purpose of this at a home level may be a little bit too much, but for our commercial sake, every time we sterilize bulk media, we take a small sampling out of one bag and we put it onto agar. And that is because, again, when we were talking about grain and different harvests, there is the potential for a huge variation in initial spore load on any of our raw materials. So our hardwood sawdust, our soy, which comes in pellets at soy hulls, is a big part of our media, is almost always the dirtiest part of our process. Now, with our oyster mushrooms, our media is 50% of this soy. Last week, we finally realized that we have been using highly contaminated soy hulls, and it wasn't until after 2 weeks of QC testing proving a lot more mold growth that we finally were able to realize it was the soy, after it was so humid that it literally got coated in trichoderma, so we could finally see the contamination. There's the potential for any raw ingredient you use to be very contaminated. Now, everything gets sterilized, right? So all of the media gets sterilized, but even still, through whatever sterilization process you have, if the mold count is 1,000 times higher, you could still potentially have 2% left over versus 0.002% left over. Okay, and so that 2% contamination rate is enough to outcompete anything. So for you to sit here and take a little sample and quality control it is just a peace of mind and a way to see much faster than waiting 2 weeks for your media to expose the contamination. So for our sake, in a farm where we're using bags of grain that could potentially be contaminated or anything else, it's very important that we constantly check at different stages to see if we're gaining contamination. Contamination happens to everybody. It's just a matter of how much you can get rid of, lessen it. Okay, so that being said, we are going to take this bag, clean it up. We are going to cut this open, and this whole bag is going to go into this bag of sterilized media. Now, again, we talked about spawn rates. This is probably closer to almost 40%, maybe 30% spawn rate. So in theory, this one bag could probably inoculate closer to 10 of these bags. But for sake of what we're doing here, we're just going to dump this whole thing in here, seal this up, and then be done with it. For our substrate for this one, this is our wood-based substrate, and so we do two different wood-based substrates. One of them is 50% soy hull and 50% wood, and one of them is 80% wood, 10% soy hull, and 10% seed. And the less nutritious one that is 80% wood is more appropriate for our shiitakes and our hen of the woods, which do not grow well with excessive amounts of supplementation. So the soy hull is a supplement in our media. It's higher in nitrogen, potassium, and a couple other ingredients versus the wood, which is completely cellulose and lignin based. So different, and again, these are things we know from when we bought our shiitake culture that they need a less nutritious media. So when choosing things, like your cultures, look in and consider that kind of stuff. Consider if they need something specific. Consider if there's a certain environmental temperature that they can't stand, or all kinds of things like that. This is also why we wrap all of our media that we sell in another bag, is because of the fact that that bag forms as a shell, a barrier. Even though these bags are sealed and sterile and everything else, it's a redundancy. So we're going to take out our little quality control Petri dish here. little known fact maybe, but you can also use just plastic solo cups. They come pre-sterilized for food service. But if you do use these, as soon as you open them, they need to go into another bag and stay in that bag clean. Because if you keep pulling from them, every time you reach back in the bag, you contaminate it. So that was a lesson we learned the hard way. So make sure your bag's in a bag, basically. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you see this solo cup? I'll show you.
Okay, yeah.
So basically, we just pour our agar into solo cups the same way we pour our petri dish plates that are, the true like petri plates. And that's mostly just for our quality control because it's a cheaper way to, and we use a lot more of them. But when I first started, I was working in a restaurant. I never bought petri dishes. The ones that are pre-poured that you can buy online are awesome, especially if you just don't want to. There's a reason why I'm not showing you how to pour plates in a glove box. It sucks. It's possible, it's not fun, but buying them is one of the, especially if you're only doing a few, is the better way. Now, to do a bunch of small solo cups in a glove box is not nearly as bad. So, absolutely, yep. And the good thing about it is you put the lid on, it stays airtight. You can stack them, you can watch them, you can see in there pretty good. So it's a nice thing to have on hand. And again, for just the sake of redundancy and it being a relatively cheap material, it's worth it. All right, so we're wiping down. Both of our bags are sealed. So we are going to open them. Because we're dumping all of this grain, I like to cut a lot off of there and just have a small collar. All of our media bags are pre-sealed with an injection port because there is no reason why you couldn't take a liquid culture and shoot it directly into the sterilized hardwood sawdust. There's no reason you can't do it with a spore syringe. Again, we're just talking about the odds of it being successful. So, would I shoot a spore syringe directly in here? Probably not if I paid a lot of money for it. Could it be possible? Absolutely. Would I do it with a liquid culture? Sure. The only thing to consider is, unless you have another plate to at least put a few drops of that culture in, you're basically putting it all into growing media and will never get it back unless you take tissue samples later. So it's... I'll kind of off the mushrooms, yeah. So we're going to go ahead and dump all of this in there. Save a tiny, tiny little piece. I made a boo-boo. I left my big bag clip up. See? And I'm teaching you guys this class. Yep, good thing it's just for show. So this would get clipped up, okay, with your large bag clip that you obviously have in there. We would take our control and just a tiny amount of the grain that we have left over, and we would put some of our grain in there. And we should have 2 QC plates because we should take a little bit of our media substrate and test that too. Anyway. So this is now done. Our quality control check is plated, sealed, and done. Our bag of bulk substrate is sealed and done. Huh? Sealed, okay.
What's in the solo cup? What was the medium that was in the solo
That is our charcoal agar.
Okay.
So that just has activated charcoal in it. It's easier to see some mycelium with the black, but that's the only difference between that and just a standard agar. This is the bag clip. These are bag clips. So again, just kind of set this on the back here, push the tubing up in there, and now you have a reusable way to seal your bags. Get in there. There we go. No, in fact, you want to leave some headspace if you can. Now, as long as you seal above the filter, as your mycelium ages, it will produce carbon dioxide and will naturally inflate these bags. If you never see your bag inflate, there's an issue. That means that there's either a hole in the bag, your filter is probably torn or loose and you just can't tell, or something is dead in there, because there's no reason why. The reason why these filter patches work is because they are anywhere from 5 microns to 0.5 micron, which is just small enough to allow gas to exchange. So the CO2 that this will produce will come out, but even still not all at once, but not large enough for ambient molds or bacterias to land on here and get in here. So that 5 micron is just enough to kind of put a little back pressure. So if your bags are not inflating a little bit after a week, then something is going on.
Now, would that be viable since it wasn't sterile?
You know, I would assume so. With that much spawn in there, if I don't get something grow off of this, I'll be upset. And so then, you know, all you do is just kind of real simple, just break up your media, distribute your grain the best you can. You can leave it all sit right on top. There's nothing wrong with that. It's called top spawning. If you are a huge commercial factory, that's all you ever do, because shaking your media is an excessive step that's not necessary if you have space and time. At our farm, we have a dryer, an old dryer, and so we load about 4 or 5 of these bags in there, let them tumble a couple times, we take them out, they're shaken up, they go on the shelves. So either that or it's a lot of this, and you do that to 150 bags and you get some pretty strong arms after a while. So
Once you shake that the first time, you just leave it.
that's about it.
Same thing with the.
Now there are some varieties of mushrooms, after it starts to colonize, you can shake up to kind of expedite the colonization. There are mushrooms that absolutely hate that and will never grow again. So again, that's just kind of knowing your cultures and what you're doing. If we shake up our hen of the woods culture halfway through its growth, it will never do anything. Now, and what we're going to go into next is preparing like grow medias and tubs. And again, that's the same idea. Some of them you have to fruit directly as is, don't touch it, let it do its thing, age. You know, that's shiitake's hen of the woods. Now where these king oysters or our poplar mushrooms or our gray oysters, we load these tubs, we break them up, we stack it all in there, we pack it up, and then that actually grows into one large collective organism. They reheal, and sometimes it encourages mushrooms to produce when you actually agitate and rough them up a little bit. So it's just a matter of knowing which one does which. Any questions on any of the airbox? That's about the end of that. So.
If you were to take a control on Agar and you saw that it was contaminated and you already sent your bag, would you just assume that it's contaminated, or
I would. I mean,
and then you just be done with it?
I hate throwing stuff away. So even if I saw, a mouse in one of my bags, I'd probably still see what happens. But the chances are, something will go wrong. So if you're doing this, to the 50th time, so be it. If it's your first run and you really want to see how it's supposed to be and not take any short steps, then, you would probably consider. Again, I've thrown away more media, just learning, making mistakes. It's a hard thing to load up a glove box with everything you need, and do it completely sterile. That's why eventually people start working in front of laminar flow hoods, because you're not so restricted. And that's an upgrade with sterile technique. And then you build yourself a mushroom farm with a sterile lab room in it, and then you upgrade a little bit more. But even still, you're going to have issues and contamination. Anybody else? Yeah.
I don't know when to ask this. So
Yeah.
you were using the chicken in the woods. So we forage a lot, and we just stumbled across some chicken in the woods. What's the difference between the one that we just found to yours? Is there one?
So they would be they are both, tomato plants, Yours is just a purple Cherokee and mine's a green zebra. There is almost no chance they would be genetically identical. Now, there are some fungi like the honey mushrooms that some of you may be familiar with. It's the largest organism in the world. So in Oregon and parts of Michigan and other places, there are these huge networks, thousands of square miles of this fungus. That is all the same organism. You could take that from miles away and put it on a petri dish, and they marry back together on a plate like they were taken from the same mushroom. If me and you took both of our chicken of the woods cultures and put them on the same plate, they would look almost identical, except they would never seam together. They would form this barrier in between them, just the same way that you can't, mix certain animals. You can't mix a dog and a cat, kind of thing.
So with that being said, and they're all kind of the same, if there's different companies that have these different prices, do you just shoot for the cheapest one?
And that's kind of where it just comes down to why. Why are they getting that value for certain things? If they can prove it grows with X amount of conditions every time, and as long as you can hit 68 degrees and 80% humidity and there's never a chance, then sure, pay for it. But if it's just something you found in the woods and you took a tissue culture of that you've never fruited yourself, that's why we always order from Aloha Medicinals, which is one of the world's largest culture banks out of Hawaii. But there's all kinds of good. But again, buying a culture is worth doing the research. Buying spores is much less of an issue because you are going to be the one responsible for creating your culture.
Do you run anything that you've ever found?
Not currently. Okay. The trial and error so if we took spores and we took the tip of our scalpel and sliced it through a spore print and just barely touched that onto an agar plate, we are probably going to have 100 genetic variations start. And so of those 100 genetic variations, you'll see a little faster growth on one of the hyphal tips as they all radiate out. And so we'll be like, all right, this one looks like it's leading the pack. That one looks successful. We'll take some of that and transfer it to a new plate. This one over here looks really dense and hardy. We'll take a piece of that and put it on a plate. And so now we've got these two cultures that are probably 20 different cultures. Okay, so we've gone from 100 down to 2 plates with 20. Okay, same thing, we watch it grow. We say, all right, this lead tip looks good on this plate. This one looks, and you keep going until you finally have a plate that looks like it grows out uniformly. That's an isolation. And even still, that's not a true isolation. But you could say, all right, all the growth looks uniform, it's vigorous, it's healthy. We've done this 300 times. Now let's start the process. Now let's put it to grain. And so you go to grain, 3 months later, your grain spawns already. You go to your bulk substrate and it does nothing. Like there is nothing to say that shiitake that you've spent the last 3 years isolating will ever even grow one mushroom. So it's a lot of work. The people that sell cultures are saints in my opinion because the trial and error, the amount of running through and data tracking is mind-blowing to think about. Now, that being said, if you find a really good mushroom in the woods or one that that you buy from a grocery store, take a tissue culture of it, clone it. Chances are the viability is still enough in there that if in your still air box you open that up, you take a scalpel, take a small piece of tissue, put it on your petri dish, you've just copied a culture that somebody else has grown or that has grown naturally in nature. And that is an isolated culture at that point. So chances are a lot higher that that will be successful. So, again, yeah, usually there's a certain amount of viability before they become too dry. People have revived tissue cultures after years, though. So
when you're trying to figure out what's the when you're trying to figure out which is the best and the glass growth
Tip
on
to
the-
growth, yeah.
Tip to growth in the agar plate. How long do you wait to see until you decide?
Ideally, once your culture on your plate has grown to half or 3/4 of the plate is when you want to pull transfers. You never want to let your mycelium run all the way to the edges of the Petri dish because it's hard to identify growth characteristics and things like that. So usually halfway through, and then from that, transfer it to another plate. And usually you'll notice that the growth is faster every time you transfer it, and it becomes easier to identify the better portions of that culture to perpetuate until, like I said, you'll transfer it one day and it will just grow out in this uniform, beautiful radial pattern, and you'll know you're about as close to a monoculture as you can get. Same way you get from, taking a tissue or buying a culture. It should never, a culture you buy that's a monoculture or a tissue culture should never have anything besides completely uniform growth on a plate. Anybody else? So the last thing we were going to kind of walk through is basically just how we build some of our substrate vehicles for fruiting the different varieties of mushrooms. A lot of this goes back to how they grow naturally. So that's really all you're trying to do to grow the fruiting body of your mushrooms. So the more you can understand their natural growing environment, their particular food sources, what part of the world they grow in as far as weather and climate and things like that go, even soil considerations. King oyster mushrooms don't grow native here in the States, but they grow all throughout Southern Europe into Southern Asia. And these grow prolifically in parts of Italy and places like that naturally have high lime rock. And so, because of that, what we have done is has adapted our casing that we put on top of this to have extra lime than normal. And because of that, we get this big, uniform, consistent growth. When we do it without that extra lime in there, and it could be a pH buffering thing, it could be a lot of different reasons, we don't get nearly the same productive yield. And even with some of our substrates, some of them prefer slightly more aged wood. So we will actually use some of our composted substrate that has already grown out some mycelium, that has been denatured and pitted and slightly broken down. They're not a secondary decomposer, but like chicken of the woods that you find on a log or tree that's been down for a long time, years and years. They need that wood that's a little softer. So having that knowledge will give you a much better chance than just to feeding it straight oak hardwood pellets, that would probably grow something but never give you the fruit body that you're looking for. So either buy a culture like from Aloha that you can sit there and read every growth parameter for the fruiting body on it that they could possibly give you, including natural habitat and things like that, will only give you a better sense of how to actually get the mushrooms to produce after you've done all of this work.
So when you take the substrate that's already grown, you re-sterilize all that to
Yeah,
go to the other.
Yeah. So we're actually doing it in trials with some of our poplar mushrooms, and then all of our manure substrate that we sell, all of our manure-based substrate actually has no animal manure in it. It is just composted material that we have gained that beneficial bacteria from, and then we add some worm castings to it, which are obviously also loaded with plenty of beneficial bacteria. So even though most secondary decomposers, like on huge button mushroom factories, portobello factories, are all grown off of cow and horse manure or an artificial compost that has been turned and produced to gain all that beneficial bacteria. Without that, you'd never be able to produce those mushrooms. So, again, wrapping your head around what your mushrooms need to eat and where they eat them, why they eat them, and then what happens in their environment to actually get them to grow the mushrooms are pretty important parts when you're deciding on which ones to grow. So with our tubs, basically, you know, this is a pretty simple standard practice. So this tub in here, this tray here, has 1 full bag of our black poplar. So this has been sterilized, inoculated, and aged. We can tell because the white mycelium has fully coated all of the sawdust in here. You can see a little bit of the myceliums climbing up the bag. There's no dead spots here in the bottom. There's no green spots, no discoloration. So we can assume that this was pretty successful. With a couple of our varieties, again, like with our king oysters, they benefit from being smashed and kind of broken up because as they go to heal themselves, they put in an effort to say, all right, something happened. A tree fell near us. Something's going on that we broke apart like this. So as we heal, let's put a mushroom out. And so there are certain varieties of mushrooms that sense that and need that. Now again, we talked about some things like our lion's mane and some of our beach mushrooms and our hen of the woods. If you do that to those, they will never grow a mushroom. So only certain varieties of mushrooms can be broken up, put into tubs, and fruited this way. Some of them, like our oyster mushrooms, we basically recreate a growing environment as if they were taking over a branch of a tree. So they've made their way through the heart, just under the bark, above the heartwood, so they're digesting all of that softer wood tissue in there. And let's say that a branch is broken off and there's a nick in that bark. Well, as soon as it gets cool enough outside, moist enough outside, they'll sense that tiny change in fresh air from being stifled underneath the bark of a tree to this small opening. And they'll say, all right, here's our chance. And that's where they'll put the effort in through fruiting the mushrooms. Same thing with the lion's mane. You know, they will grow their entire life cycle unseen inside, behind the bark of a tree or a log or anything. And until fall, when it cools down to 60 degrees, 45 at night, it's raining, that's when they say, all right, here's this fresh air. We've eaten enough of this food. Let's put out a mushroom and reproduce and start the process over.
So you recreate that by just slicing the bag open and putting it
Yeah, so just a little nick in here. Now, you could take this whole thing out of the bag and put it in your grow room. And what you'll do is you'll get mushrooms attempt to grow everywhere because all of a sudden it thinks, well, there's fresh air everywhere here now. And you'll get thousands of tiny little baby mushrooms that 98% of them abort. So to just let a tiny amount put all of its effort into one spot is worth it. Now with the kings, you know, again, these do better collecting themselves as one giant organism. We get, so here's the same thing, just on an individual bag with our casing on here. This is 5 of these bags in here. These 5 bags will produce almost twice as much, twice as fast as these would by themselves. Because of the greater collectiveness, they rebound faster, they heal faster, so some things just have an advantage like that. Now, you can do that with oyster mushrooms and it makes no difference. Again, it's a matter of knowing your culture, knowing where they grow, how they grow, and just really trying. We have some things that will absolutely stop growing at 68 degrees or higher in our grow rooms. This time of year is almost impossible for us to grow our beach mushrooms, and our hen of the woods mushrooms suffer greatly. Now, the temperature dropping 4 degrees or getting below like 75 at night is all we need. Now we have some varieties that will not grow below 65 degrees, that unless it's 70 to 75 degrees, will not do anything. So again, growing environment, growing encouragement is very important depending on which one. And if you've done all of this work and you have no idea how your mushrooms grow in the end, you're probably doing something wrong to start with. But most people will get like a grow kit, you know, just to see how it grows, just to see how fast of a process it is, just to see what kind of humidity requirements and things like that go. Nobody really knows the 6 months worth of effort that went into this, but if you're doing it at home, you do. So usually you're probably better off at your growing environment. other questions?
I have a question about the agar. When
Yeah.
you put it into the grain,
Mhm.
do you, I know it probably depends, but do you shake it after a little bit when it starts growing, or depends on the species?
So you take the agar, you drop it in the grain, and then do you distribute it? Yes, absolutely. Now, it depends. So typically, I only did one chunk. Usually, we do about 3 to 5 chunks per bag. And it's the same idea as spawn, your grain spawn into your bulk media. The better you distribute that more evenly through your substrate, the faster it will colonize. If you left all 5 of those pieces on top of that grain, they will all slowly work their way down to the bottom, but there's less and less air as they go down there, so growth gets stifled. So by shaking up that bag, you're putting air through the whole media, you're putting accessibility by putting some of those down in the bottom to grow upwards and meet some that are growing downwards, so it's just an exponential factor. And again, even to that point, sometimes after we introduce our agar to the grain, we let it sit for a week, and then it's advantageous for us to shake the bag again, because every one of those grains that has accepted that mycelium will then spread out, redistribute, but some of them, if we shake, will stall their growth. So again, it's very, 100%.
And if you're going to use, if you're pitching the plate after you use it, you might as well put as much on it as possible, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's if you're going to be doing it, know the limits of how thin you can stretch everything. That's what I usually try to tell people. If you know how thin and how much you can make, doing anything less than that is fine. So to know that 2% spawn rate is about the minimum that you ever want to do, doing much, 10% is a safer home rate. Doing 20% is almost guaranteed, and you're overly nutritious. So just little things like that. Like the more of the culture and the media you perpetuate to your next item, the faster, the more successful it usually is to outcompete anything you haven't fully sterilized. And that's the biggest home cultivation the tip I would tell people is err on the side of being heavy, with spawn rates, err on the side of doing things a little bit richer than spreading it as thin as you possibly can.
Because what I've done in the past with particularly difficult ones is put the agar in a ball, ball jar, and then drop it and start the culture, and then just pour over that. Pour the grain over that, because you're certain it's going to take by that point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's however you take the one media from the other. Usually the idea is you almost never want to disturb your future media. You only want to disturb your fully colonized. But that idea wouldn't be wrong either. You're just accepting a greater risk trying to dump grain into, Yep.
That was always my challenge, is always going from the agar to the grain.
Sure. Again, that's the closer you are to your beginning culture, the more important it is to really be as clean and sterile as possible. Once you've got a second generation grain spawn bag and you're going to bulk media, you can certainly get away with a lot more things as far as being less than ideally sterile at that point, especially if you're spawning heavy to encourage, more production and things like that.
I have a question about your production cycle. So how frequently are you going from your grain spawn to bulk substrate in your cycle? I guess you said 10 days for the oysters, and then how frequently do you run?
So for our production specifically out at the farm, we produce on a weekly basis. We sell mostly direct to restaurants. So we're in the restaurant rhythm is what I kind of tell people. So we plan to deliver every week. So we need to harvest X amount every week. So from those numbers of how much mushroom we need to yield, we can backtrack how much of each variety we're going to grow. So if we're going to grow 120 pounds of oyster mushrooms and 40 pounds of lion's mane, we need to know that we need to have 2 6-pound bags worth of lion's mane spawn, and we need to have 8 bags of oyster spawn every week. So going back to your grain preparations and going back to your agar, kind of like I said, we only open those plates every once in a while. We make a lot of grain masters, And those grain masters make a lot of second generation. And those second generations make a ton of third generation. So we basically, once a week, make enough spawn for 3 weeks. Almost as a redundancy, but you need to be so many weeks behind to keep it on a consistent rhythm. It really is kind of a lot to wrap your head around, especially when you start growing multiple species because of the difference in timing and even with incubation. But again, once you get used to the rhythm of making excessive amounts of spawn and knowing that you can keep some of those for months, until you absolutely need them, is always the better option versus just trying to make enough for what you think you need and then having half of it go bad. Like I said, almost everything that you make, either petri dish, grain spawn, sometimes even bulk, can be slowed down growth-wise with refrigeration. So even if like you inoculated 8 bags of your bulk substrate, a week before you go on vacation, you're like, oh, I can't fruit all of these. Put them all in the fridge. It'll slow the growth down. It'll keep you at the place to where you left off.
I call it putting them to bed.
Yeah, 100%. It's just, and even some of them freeze, like I said, well enough. But you can basically suspend almost all mycelial growth indefinitely, especially if you go to spore, and that's where we all come from. Just kidding. Anybody else? No?
When you go from your syringe to your agar place to get your cultures going, do you just leave those like an ambient until they fill the plate out, or do you do anything special with those?
You mean to watch the growth on your? Oh, yeah. So that anytime you are actively watching growth, that's called incubation. So it doesn't matter if you're incubating plates, grain spawn, or your bulk media, and there is always a specific temperature and environment for incubating every culture. Most of them are at room temperature, but some of them need it cooler and some of them need it warmer than like room temperature. So like if you grow some subtropical varieties, they'll do almost nothing at room temperature because it's on the cooler side of their natural growth. But like for all of ours, we incubate everything at 75 degrees, and that's enough. As long as you're consistent, that's how you can gauge your rhythm. If your house changes, a ton, or you have stuff down in the basement and stuff up in the attic, at 85 degrees, you're going to see a huge variation in temperature and stuff like that.
So if you wanted to store it, like freeze it, and wait until the culture was 3/4 full?
Typically, as long as you see any kind of positive growth, it could be as little as you want, but there's usually like that comfort zone of half of your plate to 3/4 of your plate being grown out that you've watched, that nothing else has popped up, little satellite on the outside. That's usually what I tell people. I just recommend having some kind of visual confirmation. Now, you could literally take your liquid culture, shoot it on your plate, and put it right in the freezer. And in theory, that will suspend everything. That liquid culture won't die. Your agar should still be viable, but, and for leaving it sit out for a week just to see it grow is worth it. Anybody else? What time are we at? Look at that, 2 o'clock. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. I hope you guys gained something out of this. Thanks, Bo, for having us out, obviously.
Yeah, thank you
Listen to
guys
me talk.
very much again for coming out.
Yeah.
Thank you to JT
Yeah.
for putting on this awesome class.
And you can find us at Mushrooms Naturally. So we're out in O'Fallon, Missouri. Our farm is open 6 days a week. You guys are all welcome to come out there anytime, take a tour. We sell all of our mushrooms, all of our grow supply, and then obviously Bo carries just about everything grow supply out here as well. So, anything you guys need from sterilized grain to pre-poured petri dishes, you can find it. It does certainly help for a lot of people to come out to the farm to get a good visual idea of growing environment. I would say that's probably the biggest takeaway when people walk into our grow rooms and stuff like that. But you know, you can also look in our lab and everything else. So
We can just show up. Or
yeah, 100%. Now, if you want a really in-depth tour, just you know, obviously, yep. Yeah. Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you. Immaculate Spores has got a present for you, so just make sure you stop up at the front desk and
Aw, presents.
we'll get you. Thank you again.
Presents for everybody.